Avanak, the administrator of the small town of Oil Grove, has hired the throne breakers to escort a shipment of valuable oil berries to the capital of Shalaz. The trip will take 7 days as they descend from the foothills of the Barrier Mountains and make their way south across the Silver Plain. It is late winter, and the last swells of warm air buffet the party. The party is joined by 2 carriage drivers, Gil and Deimos. At first, they are skeptical, having little experience working so closely with non-humans. Such apprehensions are quickly overcome when Parthenax's friendly disposition earns them a friend in Gil. Deimos remains more reserved. On the first night, Bran, the Kenku rogue, stands watch. Investigating a scuffling noise from the back of the carriage, Bran finds the driver, Deimos, stealing oil berries. Oil berries are an extremely valuable commodity because they are used for fueling lanterns. Bran is faced with a choice. Taking pity on Deimos, Bran chooses to let this infraction go, but sternly warns Deimos not to continue to steal. The next morning, the party awakens to the sun glinting across the Silver Plain. Gil tells the party that he hopes to reach the sacred temple of Lysona on Lake Asimi by nightfall. The party presses onwards. Yaki and Parthenax take this time to do some hunting. Yaki, using his longbow, kills a pygmy deer. Parthenax is less successful. Around midday, the party comes to a small valley where the Silbus River cuts across the plains. A dense thicket of trees surrounds the giant stone bridge. The wagon creakily descends into the valley. As the wagon creaks across the stone bridge, Leonid hears a series of splashes from the river. Out of the trees come several barrier men, warriors descending from the mountains to raid. The barrier men catch the party by surprise. Several swarm out of the brush, taking Yondar and Churbs. Churbs, struck with a vicious attack from a longsword, goes down. Yondar, surrounded, reflexively takes the form of a desert scavenger, a large, powerful lizard. Bran and Leonid rush to Churbs' aid, driving back the raiders' leader. Churbs, recovering from the mighty blow, turns and smites through a raider as he charges. In the chaos, several of the barrier men attempt to grab oil berries and run, and one of the cart drivers is wounded, with a stab to the thigh. Eventually, their opponents are scattered or dead, with one captured alive. Now the clock is ticking. Deimos needs medical care urgently, as he has taken a deep spear wound to the thigh. Churds volunteers to steer the cart in his stead and makes great pace. The party reaches the Temple of Lysonis as night falls. The temple has an eerie atmosphere. A collection of priestesses make offerings to their goddess of reincarnation, placing packages that would have been the dead's last meals into an eternal flame. Outside, the shores of the lake are dotted with mystical orchards, producing dazzling, incredibly sweet fruit. These fruits even have the ability to heal, and they are used to restore Deimos to health. The party comes to the head priestess, Thea, for guidance on how to treat their new prisoner. The priestess asks the party if they think the man is good or evil. After discussing, the party concludes that their prisoner, Zlatov, is not a bad man. His violence was only committed out of a conviction to his people. Priestesses take Zlatov and feed him a final feast of divine fruits, which kill him. During the night, Yondar watches as a dark shape emerges from the pristine lake, dragging the body of Zlatov back with it. The party decides to leave quickly the next morning. After several more days of travel, the party arrives at the town of Skalitz. They stop at the High Horse, a seedy establishment well known to thieves. The barkeep, Gordos, is heavily involved with the Rokosian Thieves Guild. Inside, they find the boisterous Boyd Brattleheim, a dwarf. Boyd takes issue with Leonid due to the long-standing enmity between dwarves and gnomes. Parthenax, with a touching speech about the perils of hatred for hatred's sake, is able to not only cool the situation, but earn a friend in Boyd Brattleheim. Meanwhile, Voth Taleth practices his thieves' cant with Gordus and makes a valuable contact. The next morning, the party sets off again, arriving in Shalaz by the evening. Along the way, they pass under the shadow of the great temple of the All-God, a mysterious temple of a one-eyed, one-armed deity whose construction has been lost to time. The party eventually rattles into the busy port city. defined by its 3 hills and its grand assembly building. They collect a reward for jobs well done from the militia commander Papadelius, or Papa by his friends, and thus ends the second session of the Thronebreakers campaign. Hi everyone, and thanks for coming back to watch another campaign diary. For this diary, I'm mainly going to be focusing on traveling and a few thoughts I have on making it more fun, both for you, presumably as the DM, and for your players. And the reason I'm making this is obviously because the session I played was travel focused, but also I want to talk about travel specifically and focus in on that because I see it talked a lot about online as the weakest of the 3 pillars of Dungeons & Dragons, specifically in 5th edition. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the 3 pillars refers to kind of the 3 core experiences or the 3 things that mechanics in D&D are made for. And that's traveling, which is what we're talking about today, combat, and social encounters. And combat and social encounters are really the big focus for a lot of people, and traveling is oftentimes completely left out. And I don't really disagree that traveling is particularly weak in 5th edition. There isn't a whole lot of great guidance. There's obviously nothing nearly as much as there is for combat. Everything is combat focused in Dungeons & Dragons. I mean, social encounters aren't really even given that much focus. But traveling, I think, is also really difficult because it's something that most of us don't have that much experience with. I don't think very many people have ever been in a situation where traveling has been a serious threat in the same ways that it would be in Dungeons & Dragons. You know, gathering food, finding water sources, avoiding animals. These aren't things that a whole lot of people deal with regularly in the same ways that comes with the Dungeons & Dragons game. Whereas for social encounters, we have the crutch of being the fact that we're social animals. But anyway, so getting into the session itself. So you guys all watched the narrative stuff, so I don't need to explain what happened there. But I guess a big disclaimer that I will have to get out of the way is that you should really only be running travel in your games if there's a point to it. And that's the same reason you do anything in a game. And this is something that seems kind of obvious, but you really want to be cognizant of the fact that whatever you're doing should have some sort of point. So with travel, there should be a reason why you're zooming in and describing and playing out the travel. And the number one reason is that there's drama or tension. The travel needs to actually be completed. There's a chance that the players could not successfully complete the travel, or oftentimes travel comes in when it's time sensitive. So, for example, in the session that I ran, the players had to escort the caravan, and that meant that a significant delay or harm to the cargo could have consequences for the party, and this was clear to the party. The party knew basically why we were doing travel is because there was a chance that they could not get their full reward if they didn't make it on time, or if they lost some of the cargo. So if there are no clear consequences for failing at travel, and especially if the players don't know, then it's going to feel forced. It's going to feel the players are going to ask questions like, why are we doing this? Or they're going to act in very strange ways because they don't understand why they're doing this. So even if you have the idea, you want to communicate that somehow to the players. So I was just explicit. I told the players the contract you're taking says you have to be there in 7 days. If you're not there in 7 days, then you're going to lose money. You might lose the whole contract. You might lose something. And I reminded them of that as it went on. So I reminded them when they were faced with a choice, well, if you do that, you're going to slow down and you might not be able to make it on time. So you want to have consequences that are clear to the players so they know why we're playing this. And then in connection with consequences is the fact that something you have to deal with is the fact that engaging dramatic travel is really tied to the player's level, and secondly to the environment they're traveling in. A low-level party is really the only group that's going to have is going to face any challenge in most travel scenarios. So if they're traveling along a road, if there's a road that exists you're probably a 10th, 15th, 20th level party should really, under almost all circumstances, not really need to play out that, because there's not going to be any sort of realistic challenge that they could face. Now, of course, as you get into extreme environments, you can bump the levels up. So a vast desert being traveled by a high level party but could be played out. But generally, a lot of your travel is going to be played out in those early levels. We're talking like probably 0 to like 5, maybe 6 or 7. And you're going to have to get into extreme environments generally if you want to challenge the party at higher levels. And so I would generally caution against having in-depth travel often. And that means not every travel should be played out like how I'm going to talk about this session. Travel should be something that happens every once in a while. You play it out for one of the reasons that we talked about above, for a narrative reason. Unless, of course, you have clearly communicated to the players that that's the kind of campaign that you want to run. And so the reasons that I chose, and another reason I chose to do travel in this encounter is because it's the second session. And traveling is a great way to introduce the world to your players. So travel is also great in those early sessions to kind of build your atmosphere and to really show the players the world that they are in and get them engaged. But anyway, so how did I prepare for this session? Well, one thing that was helpful is I already had a regional map prepared, and regional maps are talked about a lot, and I would really suggest making a regional map for your campaign. Now, regional means like a zoomed in small area, and for me, I already had the route. I could just do the route, which is where my finger goes here. I could just map that out, and then I just looked at what I had already drawn, and that was able to spark my imagination. So I would really suggest using some form of regional map. It doesn't have to be particularly artistic. It's just nice to not, it kind of front loads some of that preparation for any sort of travel that you're doing across like the entire campaign. And from there, I divided the travel into 7 days, and for each day I wrote one sentence on what the players would do or see or encounter on that day. So for example, on the first day I wrote that the players find out that Deimos, the character driver, is stealing from the cargo. And for the third day I wrote the party comes to the Temple of Lasona on Lake Asimi. And that was all I wrote for those days to start with. And an important thing to keep in mind is that not every day needs to be a big deal, but you should generally be writing something for about every day if you're running travel that's going to take place over the course of, usually travel tends to be like 1 week, maybe 10 days. And if you're running like a month-long travel, you probably don't need to write for every day. But for this sort of travel, just taking it day by day, and not every day needs to be a big deal. Nothing particularly exciting happens, and you can just do it, and you can literally just read the players that sentence. For example, I think it was on the 4th day, shepherd blocks your path and you are slowed down by an hour, and that was it. And that was what we did for the 4th day. And it was just as fast as I just read it to you. It took 5 seconds. Little things like that just keep the narrative going. So rather than being like on the 1st day you fight and on the 5th day you get to the temple, just having those one sentences kind of bridges the gap and makes it more of a roller coaster rather than like a death drop. In terms of the narrative, this system is kind of scalable, so I would not, even if as the time increases that the players are traveling, you can still keep doing it in one session by just scaling the amount of actual big days. So what I did is I marked out 3 of these days to be big days where we would actually really play them out, and that was going to be the combat encounter on the 2nd day, getting to the temple on the 3rd day, and getting to Skalitz, the town, and the inn on the 5th day. Those were the 3 things that I really that I prepared to play out. So for that, I made I prepared NPCs and actual descriptions I could read to the players of the locations. So if you're doing a month-long travel, I would do the same thing. Pick 3-4 days that you want to zoom in on. That way you're keeping yourself budgeted for a session. So if you know your party, you know how long one of these things is probably going to take, and so you can estimate out how many you can do in a session while keeping it, and then you can just fill the time in with those one-sentence descriptions. And when I say time, the narrative time, not the actual session, real-life time. And so the important thing to keep in mind when you're making these encounters, and this really goes for any sort of encounter, not just for travel encounters, is that every encounter should have a point. The NPC party, usually the party would be interacting with NPCs when they're in an encounter, should have a goal or something that they want to do. So a reason that they're going to be interacting with the party. So this is something I try and keep in mind whenever I'm making encounters, and it's something that you should also keep in mind, particularly with NPCs. Now, if you're dealing with a natural environment, not so much, but even then, the natural environment should have a point. Like, why are we actually playing this out? Why are we not Why are we not just hand waving it? And having these sort of things, or essentially, and this was really big in my second session, because this is my second session, so I wanted to show the players, especially the players who hadn't played D&D before, that D&D is different from a video game. So I was just watching a YouTube video about Dark Souls. So if you notice in Dark Souls, whenever you die in Dark Souls, every enemy just stops what they're doing because they've killed you, and that's the only thing that they're there to do. And that's the experience that I really don't want in my D&D games. I don't want the players to feel like everything in this world is either trying to help you or to kill you. Everything wants to interact with you. It's fine to have NPCs that don't do exactly what the party wants to do and don't actively try and harm the party. You can sometimes show them a glimpse of a parallel NPC who's pursuing a parallel goal, or maybe it's a goal that intersects with the party. But emphasizing that each character has their own goals, for me, is what really makes D&D its own unique game, and it brings a unique experience that players aren't really going to get anywhere else. And it brings them into your world and shows that the world is alive. And so here's like an example of that actually in practice. So in the narrative, you heard that during the raider attack, the raiders actually are there to steal the oil bears. Now that's kind of obvious, but I actually made them in the moment actually on some occasions prioritize stealing from the carriage over killing the party. I didn't want to get that experience where it's like, oh, the whole world revolves around us and it's just out there to kill us. No, actually, these NPCs really want what's in the carriage. They don't want to kill you if they don't have to. They would be just fine with running away if they could get what they wanted. So that's an experience, especially in those early sessions, that I wanted to show for my players. Now, if you're running like a much more fantastical campaign where the world really does revolve around the players, then I guess then that this isn't so necessary. But this is the type of world that I like to create. And staying on the idea of creating a lived-in world for players, another great advantage of a travel session, another reason you would do a travel session, is that it lets you flesh out the world and make it feel lived in. And there are a couple ways you can do this. Obviously, we talked about just briefly about giving NPCs objectives and motivations that don't necessarily involve helping or hurting the party. But another way is actually in the way that you describe the world. So right here, I have a tool that I used in this session and I've used in other sessions, and that is a book on zoology. This specifically is actually speculative zoology, and I'm going to get into why I like speculative zoology for this in a second. But I will go over something else first, actually, because I want to just set the scene. So I like to include descriptions of ecology for my world, but it doesn't have to be ecology. It can be any sort of thing. So it could be architecture. It could be artwork. It could be culture. It could be language. It should be something that you're familiar with that you can kind of use D&D as an opportunity to express things that you're interested in to your party, and because you're interested in it, you know a lot about it, and you can actually really flesh it out and make it in depth. So I went with zoology for this session, and I go for it a lot because I have a hobby interest in it, and I might as well use that information for D&D. And so for ecology, here's how I go about using it to flesh out my world. So I have two kind of techniques I use. First of all, whenever I have my players go to a place, I always just base the landscape on a place I've actually been to and that I know something about. And I just change words around, or I just change things around so my players don't know. So for example, this session, my party spent a lot of time traveling through like a grassland. So when I was actually describing it to my players, I'm visualizing South Dakota, where my family's from. So I'm just visualizing, the Great Plains, the hills, the Black Hills, the Badlands, the herds of bison, the herds, and we'll not have cattle. I didn't have cattle in this session. But the visualizing the landscapes that I know, because then when my players ask me, okay, I go out foraging, I've been out there, I know what's out there, I say, oh, well, you find a prickly pear cactus. And then for the actual animals, back to speculative zoology, I like to use animals or creatures that my players are not familiar with, so that my players are kind of pricks, but I don't know if you guys deal with this, but so they're not like, that's not how that works. I don't want to use a cow or something, because then one of my players is going to be like, that's not what a cow does, or cows are like this, not like that. I want to implicitly have them always trust my authority as a DM. I don't want them to be able to say, that's not how that works. Hold on, wait a second, he's making this up. That's why I like speculative zoology, because all the animals in this are made up, but they are realistic. So for example, that's a stupid one. Here would be a good one. So this is Giants of the Great Plains. It's a speculative look at what a rhinoceros or a antelope might evolve to look like. And it's just little things like that. It's a believable animal, and because I've read the description of that book, I know infinitely more about it than anybody in my party would know. So if they ask questions, I have the best shot at answering it, and they're not going to be able to correct me. So for example, in this session, when the players went hunting and they got a small roll for a small creature, I used a real animal called the vampire deer or the pygmy deer, which is a strange creature. Not a lot of I doubt any of my players really knew anything about it. So just knowing that it existed just gave me a little bit of like a leg up. So I was able to be assertive, and the players couldn't question what this creature does because they don't know anything about it. So I can kind of go where I want with what it's going to be. And using another advantage of using these kind of alien worlds or changing things up is that it makes little mundane things like going out hunting a little discovery, a little moment for the players to actually feel like they're learning something new. If the player went out and found a rabbit, players already know about rabbits. They're not going to be super engaged with that, but finding a pygmy deer, that's kind of an interesting experience. And so a final strategy that I used in this session is what I call spotlighting, which is creating specific challenges that give each player a chance to shine. And that was really one of the big things that made this travel session, I think, really enjoyed by my players. And traveling, you can do this in every session, and I would keep it in mind whenever you're making encounters or challenges for the players. But specifically for traveling, because you're going to so many different places over a travel session, you have the opportunity to throw a lot of very different challenges at the players, and you can give each of them an opportunity to shine. So for example, after the carriage driver is wounded in the ambush, Churbs, the paladin, had the opportunity to use the very rarely used land vehicle proficiency. So he got a chance to use a skill that nobody else has, and it would only work in this is one of the very few situations where it's useful. So you want to keep an eye out, especially for rare skills like that, for the situations where they might actually be useful. And I specifically did this because this player had kind of complained or questioned why they even bothered to have this, because it seemed so useless. So I wanted to make them feel like their decisions they made for their character do matter,
and are more than just flavor, even if it is really just a flavor decision. And then another example is that because I have 2 rogues, making a town focused around the Thieves Guild gave both of them the opportunity to practice Thieves' Cant, to get to know other thieves, to make these kind of underhanded contacts, things that really only their characters, because of the classes they chose, can do, and you really have to actively create situations. Thieves' Cant doesn't come up a whole lot because you have to actually actively create the situation. It's not often that the players are going to pursue a situation where they can use it, in my experience. Other examples in the session would be including the dwarf, Boyd Brattleheim. Boyd, because he's a dwarf, in my world, dwarfs have an enmity with gnomes, so that gave the player who's playing a gnome the opportunity to kind of role play a little bit what it's like to be a gnome, what it's like to interact with a dwarf, and it's something that only his character could have. So spotlighting is a great thing to do in travel. So each day there might be 1 or 2 things a day that different party members can specialize in, and over the whole session I had an opportunity for every player, I feel like, to really strut their stuff and show what makes their character, what makes Parthenax, what makes Leonid, etc. And so I've talked a lot about a lot of different things in this diary, but I want to just take a brief moment to summarize the strategies and what I recommend for when you're running travel, to kind of synthesize everything. So number 1, write a sentence each day and pick 3, probably write a sentence for each day and pick 3, maybe 4, maybe 2, depending on how long your sessions are, and make them big moments where you zoom in and you play it out. The other ones, leave them at a 1-sentence description that you just read or you say to the party. And then secondly, make sure that you're only taking the time to play out travel when you want to communicate something in specific to the players, when you want to communicate a narrative experience, you want to communicate something. Don't just run travel because the players are actually traveling between 2 areas. If my players are traveling from one side of the world to the other side, but I don't have anything, and none of us are interested in the actual experience of travel, don't run it. Don't feel the need to run it. You can hand wave it. Especially if you're working with higher level players, because then it's just going to be them strutting through every challenge you throw at them, which can be fun for the players for a little bit, but after a whole session of it, it gets tiring. And a great example, so if you need help figuring out ideas for when to run travel, here's a few. So I just showed one, is to flesh out the world. So those early first few sessions, give them a chance to go out and explore the world, basically, and find out what's there, show off your specific knowledge. For me, it was ecology, but it could be architecture, art, language, culture, it could be geology, it could be all these other things that you're interested in. So that's the chance for you to strut your stuff and show the players that you really know this world. Maybe even make them think you know your own world better than you really do. And so yeah, those are my main ideas for running travel. So thanks for watching, everybody, and I really appreciate all the views on the last video. I got like 200 views, which is crazy for my first video, and I appreciate the support from you guys. And so for my next diary, my 3rd session for this campaign is going to be about one that didn't go as well as these first 2, and I'll be talking about the slog, what a lot of people call the slog, the slump, the tough session, and how I power through it, but also how I like to stay motivated after a tough session. And I'll probably also end up talking a little bit about trying to run sessions in the cities, because that's one of my biggest weaknesses, and I found I have a lot of slog sessions and weaknesses, or in cities. So those are the things I'll be talking about, which are going to be tough things to talk about because I'm making a YouTube channel, and I don't run perfect sessions all the time. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. And yeah, and thank you to the 3 people who subscribed to me. It means a lot. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.